Karen Wells is Assistant Dean, Department of Geography, Environment and Development Studies at Birkbeck University of London. She's the author of Childhood in a Global Perspective, and the focus of her research is on how global processes and structures interact with practices of childhood in local contexts and the resulting effect on children's lives. At the summit, Dr. Wells will discuss the concept of circulating children, how children and ideas of children circulate between the global and local contexts. Karen will be presenting, or Dr. Karen Wells will be presenting this session, and we hope that you'll all remain in here for the next 30 minutes or so to listen to her and appreciate how she is really delving into what childhood means. And so we welcome Dr. Karen Wells. Okay?
Thanks, Diane. I'm very pleased to be here today. Thanks for inviting me. As Diane says, the topic of my keynote is Circulating Children, Journeys Around the Local and the Global. Oh, and it's up on the screen. So I'm going to start by explaining why I chose this title of Circulating Children. Child circulation is a concept that I first came across some years ago in the work of Claudia Fonseca on practices of informal fostering among poor families in Brazil. It captures the idea that when living in poverty, children are often moved around, circulated, to protect them from the effects of crisis, usually economic, but sometimes social or interpersonal. These movements are not usually linear. Rather, children move from one family to another, or from a family to an institution, and then back again. They circulate between families, between households, and sometimes between institutions in response to a range of what is called in development economic shocks. For me, it's a very powerful concept because it captures a number of different local practices and social facts that shape the lives of poor children and both protects them, or certainly aims to protect them, and at times makes them vulnerable. And it disrupts the idea that these movements are always linear and in some sense progressive. This concept of circulation also captures the way that ideas about children are always moving. Our claims about what children need, what they know and what they can do, what you might call their competencies, their capacities and vulnerabilities, are based on ideas that circulate at a number of different levels, from individual families to global policy forums, such as this, journeying between the local and the global. They are rooted in different histories and different cultural contexts, and they are often incommensurable with one another, though not necessarily less ethical for that. In this Global Summit of Childhood, I hope that we can attend to both the local and the global, and the ideas that circulate between them, in developing our thinking about what our responsibilities are towards global children. So today I'm going to talk about different kinds of circulation and their impact on children and childhood. Globalisation has involved a significant expansion in the scale of human movement across national and regional borders, but also within countries. The migration of children, both alone and with their families, and the reshaping of family life when parents migrate without their children are some of the clearest effects of contemporary globalisation on children and youth. Migration of parents and children should be understood in the context of a general crisis in social reproduction, in which migration and the formation of spatial social networks within space, but networks also between people, are critical to how families manage social reproduction at different scales, including the global. Let me explain what I mean by social reproduction. This is an important concept in understanding the structural causes of child vulnerability. It has been called life's work. It refers to the physical and emotional work that is necessary for life to continue, including biological reproduction, but of course not limited to it. It views the purpose of production from the perspective of the labourer, that is, production is to enable life, not to accumulate profit. From the perspective of the owner of the means of production, the owner of land, of machinery, of factories, the point of production is to increase profit. But from the point of view of the labourer, the purpose of production is to generate the means to make life materially and symbolically possible and secure, to buy or make food, to pay for homes, to engage in culture and to raise children. In a global capitalist economy, which is what we're living in, much of the stuff that is needed to make the work of social reproduction possible is increasingly commoditised, turned into commodities. This is essential to understand and essential to recognise in thinking about children's welfare. The basic stuff of life has been turned into commodities. This is so whether we think of it in relation to, say, housing and the speculation in house and land prices, in relation to food and the unequal distribution of nutritional food, the irony of net food exporting countries being also the countries with high levels of child malnutrition, or the commodification of care. These costs, the costs of social reproduction, are unequally shared between three groups: the state, where it can take that responsibility, capital, the owners, the people that produce for profit, and labourers, families and workers themselves. In a global economy where neoliberalism has been accepted as the dominant mode of political and economic organisation, that is to say, where the idea that we are all liberal individuals who are simply responsible for our own well-being and not for that of others, these costs have fallen on the shoulders increasingly of individuals and families. The circulation of children has become one of the central mechanisms through which the poor and middle classes in developing countries manage the multiple crises in social reproduction generated by global capitalism. Mothers migrate and leave their children behind, and children left behind find that they are in a new relationship to their fathers, their grandparents and their siblings, and often these children will themselves move to another family. One of the ironic effects of the integration of women into productive work in the developed countries is that the work of social reproduction and caring is increasingly being done by migrant women. It's ironic, of course, because we like to think that a gender division of labour and increased gender equality has occurred in the developed or advanced capitalist countries, and in some senses it has, but the gender division of labour persists. It simply gets done by women from other countries, either in private households or in institutions. More often than not, domestic workers have left behind their own children to be cared for by others while they try to mother at a distance. Increasingly, the literature on global care chains acknowledges that there are material and emotional costs of migration on both mothers and the children they leave behind. But these costs are often quickly glossed over, partly and understandably, out of a desire not to criticise women domestic workers who are already getting quite a hard deal. The still very small academic research on the impacts of parental migration on separated children acknowledges that there has been little research done on the effects of these kinds of transnational migration of parents on children left behind. Geraldine Pratt, in her activist and ethnographic work with Filipino domestic labourers here in Canada, although sympathetic to the desire not to perpetuate negative stereotypes that, quote, circulate in the Philippines about maternal abandonment by migrant mothers, is also concerned about what she calls a silence about this issue in Canada and a complacency around what has been called stratified reproduction, whereby different groups of parents have unequal rights and capacity to care for their own children on a daily basis. Global care chains have mostly focused on two regions: Latino migration to North America and the migration of Asian domestic and health workers. These migrations are important and have captured the imagination of researchers, not least because of the challenge they represent to social categories like family and nation. However, migration across international borders represents a very small part of all migration. Most people migrate within their country or into border zones. Many more children are left behind as a consequence of this scale of migration than global migration. In China, for example, around 20 million children are without parental care. There, the phenomenon of children left behind is tied to the migration of rural workers to urban centres. This is creating a large population of children left behind by one, usually the father, and sometimes both parents, and these children are usually cared for by their grandparents. This research has produced some interesting insights into the impacts of being left behind, in particular on the negative psychological and health outcomes, especially for younger children if their mother migrates. Returning to my concept of social reproduction, it is important to keep in mind that these workers are migrating in an attempt to end the precarious and fragile economic conditions of their lives through investing in better educational outcomes for their children, which, they hope, will translate into more secure economic futures. We still know little about whether these hopes become realities for the children of international domestic workers. So, my first excursion into the idea of circulating children focused on two movements: mothers migrating to look after the children and households of rich people, and to work as nurses and ancillaries in the global north, and ideas about what children need to flourish, and how important the idea of the educated child has become to contemporary visions of a good childhood. My second movement focuses on the circulation of children themselves, this time in sub-Saharan Africa, and the fostering of children by near or distant relatives and what anthropologists call social kin. This practice, called fosterage by the anthropologists who have studied it, has a long history in West Africa where much of the research has been done. More recently, there have been studies of the same practice in Central, East and South Africa. The fosterage of children in West Africa mostly happens around puberty, and in most cases the child is sent to help with chores, to look after younger children, and to get an education or training. They may move to help out another household, and in those cases the sending family is likely to be better off than the receiving family. They may be moved in order to construct or thicken a relationship between two households, to create a social network between these two households. And in these cases, the sending household is likely to be worse off than the receiving household. The effect of child circulation might be to equalise the size of households that make up an extended family, or to give the child easier access to schooling or to an apprenticeship. In some cases, the motivation is to improve the child's health and nutrition. In migrant families, children may be sent to other families back home to ensure that they are familiar with cultural practices and remain fluent in their mother tongue. These movements are often temporary and may be multiple, with a child moving to different households throughout his or her childhood. This reflects local ideas about what children need in their best interests. They need to create networks, they need to strengthen the connections between themselves and other families. Among fostering families in Africa, being attached to multiple households is seen as beneficial to both children and their families. Generally, the point of circulation is that it is temporary, since it is this movement backwards and forwards or around, that creates a web of connection between the two or more households that the child has lived or is living in. Though some children may stay in their new home throughout their childhood and may be adopted formally or informally. Although most children circulating in this way are not in their early childhood, infants and young children are sometimes fostered and adopted, although clean break adoption is not generally practiced in sub-Saharan Africa. These movements of children between households are clearly related to sharing the costs of social reproduction. But it is also noteworthy that underlying them is a conception of children as being adaptive. The idea that the young child has a singular attachment to his or her birth mother seems to be largely absent in cultures where fosterage is practiced on a wide scale. Not to say the child won't have an attachment to their birth mother, but that it isn't a singular attachment. It's possible to have multiple attachments to different adults. This does not mean that children are not valued. They clearly are. And indeed, social personhood is deeply tied up with child rearing. Social personhood means the recognition that you are a person. And in fact, infertility is a common reason for a child to be given to another household. Although fostering and adoption continue to be practiced, the norms of social parenthood are changing. Western discursive norms about what constitutes a family, circulated by NGOs, churches and schools, are influencing adults and children's perceptions about where children belong. Researchers' informants say we are less social now, and fostering, which in the past created kinship and bound more distant kin together, is now increasingly restricted to close family. My third movement is of a circulation that is often discussed from the point of view of adoptive families or would-be parents in the global north and their needs, the adoption of children across international borders. This is another form of child circulation, albeit in one in which, in some senses, the child doesn't go back, though often when that child becomes an adult, they do indeed return and try to seek out their families of origin. It's also structured by local conceptions of who children are and who they belong to, and what the relations are between biological and social parents. Katrine Kajia's film, Mercy, Mercy, illustrates many of the issues raised by transnational adoption and how it is shaped by international law and cultural discourses about children's vulnerabilities and their competencies. In the documentary, she follows two siblings, a girl and a boy, in their journey from being placed in an orphanage in Ethiopia through to adoption by a Danish couple. The adoptive parents do not speak the children's first language, Amharic, and the children, when they are adopted, unsurprisingly, don't speak Danish. The birth parents are both HIV positive, and at the time that they placed the two children in the orphanage, they did that, believing that they had not long to live. They agreed to give the children to the Danish couple, but thought that this would be an expansion of their family to incorporate the Danish couple rather than a relinquishing of their rights over their children. The Danish parents, both psychotherapists, did not want to retain contact with the birth parents. The birth parents are still alive, having been treated with ARVs, antiretrovirals, which have kept them well. They have repeatedly tried to make contact with the adoptive parents and their children, but they have never been allowed to see their children again. The older girl did not adjust to living with the Danish couple, whose treatment of her was apparently harsh and judgmental. I say apparently to avoid a libel claim, but really. After several years, they had her placed in a therapeutic community, essentially a care home, but they still have custody of her, and they are still refusing to let her birth parents see her or have any contact with her. According to the documentary, the Ethiopian NGO was culpable in the separation of the children from their birth parents, knowing that, despite the birth parents' wishes to be in touch with the children after their adoption, and the NGO's reassurance that this would happen, the NGO knew that, in fact, it would not happen. This film and related cases, for example, the illegal attempt to place children from Chad into adoption in France in 2007, Madonna's highly publicised adoption of two orphans from Malawi, both the children have got birth parents still alive, or the USA missionary organisation who attempted to place Haitian children with adoptive US families after the earthquake in Haiti, but were arrested. All of these cases illuminate important issues about the connections between precarious social reproduction, globalisation, and child circulation or child mobility. In each case, the question of what makes a child an orphan, for example, is different in global and local contexts, and it's that difference which is at the heart of decisions about whether child mobility is in the child's best interests. The international NGO practice of calling children orphans who have lost one parent has played an important role in the discursive construction of children living in poverty as orphans. People without anyone to care or advocate for them, which is what the word orphan means in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. In this context, or so the argument goes, the loss of a parent can make the already precarious household economy unviable, rendering children vulnerable to homelessness, malnutrition, and exploitation. In other words, materially, whether a child loses one parent, both parents, or, as in Mercy Mercy, neither parent, does not make a significant difference to their material conditions, or so the argument goes. The problem with this argument, leaving aside the lack of any empirical data to support it, is that even if materially the child is in a similar position, socially and symbolically they are not. To be an orphan in any context implies that a child has no adult who is emotionally invested in advocating for and protecting the child. This is even more so in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, where wealth in persons is as important as wealth in things in determining social position and social protection. It is the discursive construction of poor children as orphans that has made them vulnerable to being rescued by NGOs and international celebrities. Transnational adoption should be considered as a specific kind of child circulation that impacts especially on early childhood and is a direct consequence of global inequalities and uneven development. This is the case where the parents give their children up for private adoption or the child is released for adoption by state authorities. There is growing policy evidence, for example, that governments in developing countries use transnational adoption to solve the crisis of care caused by poverty and conflict. The rapid expansion of transnational adoption, which is happening now in Ethiopia, is indicative of this trend. This is an echo of practices in Brazil, where parents who place their children in care in periods of familial crisis with the intention of taking them back home when the crisis passes, often find that the child has been adopted overseas without their consent. Conversely, as seen in the highly publicised attempt of a group of USA missionaries to organise the adoption to the States of Haitian children, parents may give their children for adoption, believing that it is in their best interest to do so, but that belief is rooted itself in the inequalities of uneven development in the global economy. The availability of children for adoption from one country to another is a consequence of a crisis in social reproduction in child-sending countries. Most transnational adoptions are arranged because natal families do not have the material means to provide for their children. This lack of resources is often a consequence of exceptional circumstances, for example, war. However, for many families, their inability to provide for their children is not exceptional. It is a persistent consequence of poverty, often aggravated by serious illness and death, including from AIDS-related conditions. To bring the discussion full circle, David Eng has provocatively argued that transnational adoption should be considered as part of global care chains. Here, though, the work that is expected of the migrant labourer, that is the adopted child, is not cooking and cleaning, but the emotional labour of completing the white middle-class family in the heartland of global capitalism. The final movement I want to discuss is of children migrating alone. These children challenge the conceptual boundaries of childhood. Although the lone child migrant is rarely alone, the idea of independent movement by children undermines the foundational concept of the child as a dependent. Like the other forms of migration discussed above, independent child migration is compelled by the wider forces of economics, politics, and conflict, erasing or unsettling the boundary between the putative private world of children and the public sphere. I'm going to discuss briefly three forms of independent migration: migration for work, forced migration, and migration through private fostering. Migration for work is in many cultures a route through which young people make their transition to adulthood. Migration in much of the world is compelled by difficult economic circumstances and the impossibility of finding the resources locally through which claims to becoming or being a young adult can be made, to securing, in other words, a successful transition to adulthood. And leaving home is perhaps one of the simplest ways to assert a change in social status. This generates cultures of migration, in which to move away and to return become themselves signifiers of adulthood. Among the Hazaris of Afghanistan, for example, Monsuti has written of boys who migrate so that they can return as men. In Bolivia, Sam Punch has written about the struggle of young rural Bolivians to accumulate sufficient resources to set up home or to make a contribution to the household commensurate with their status, their emergent status as young adults. In China, Xiaohua Lu has written about the struggles of young men to be recognised as adults in a rural area that has few possibilities for work, leading to periodic migration as a necessary strategy for becoming an adult. In many parts of West Africa, boys, and to a lesser extent girls, move away from home to other villages and towns for multiple reasons, including seeking novelty and excitement, perhaps to make some money to buy things for themselves or to learn new skills, but also to have this status conferred on them as people who are becoming adult. Often youth migration in precarious economic conditions involves seeking out risky opportunities that offer the hope of relatively quick gains in capital and perhaps a promise of a spectacular return home with a clearly transformed status from child to adult. For example, young migrants, mostly boys, go to artisanal mines where they can easily find some employment and the prospect of making exceptional wealth. For girls, migration is often more risky and less integrated into cultural norms, so girls may find it harder to return once they have left home. Urban sex workers, for example, are often migrant girls who find it difficult in the city to make a viable living and who may be duped into or accept prostitution as a necessary way to make a life. Boys generally have more spatial freedom than girls, and it may be for this reason that girls' migration is often more constrained and controlled by their families than the migration of boys. Domestic work, for example, is often a route for girls' migration. Perhaps it will be organised by the girl's parents. It might involve social networks that the girl's family are already involved with. For example, the kin in another village or town in the kinds of movements that I talked about earlier. Indeed, one of the effects of globalisation, as I've already noted in relation to transnational adoption, has been to stretch networks across national and even continental borders that would have been much more local in an earlier era. The second kind of independent migration I want to talk about is asylum seekers and refugee children. The migration trajectories that children and youth follow then are often shaped by cultural norms of migration in the transition to adulthood, as well as by efforts to make social reproduction more secure by linking less developed to more developed spaces and economies. The increase in youth migration from Afghanistan to the global north is a good example of this. Afghans are now the largest refugee population in the world. Refugee flows have been triggered by a series of conflicts since the early 1980s. But Afghan migration is also driven by a fragile economy that, especially across the permeable Afghanistan-Pakistan border, leads to high levels of labour migration. In Pakistan, this has mostly been family migration, but there's increasing evidence that since the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, increasing numbers of teenage Afghan boys are migrating alone and migrating further. Afghan boys are now the largest group of unaccompanied asylum seekers in Britain, and there are large numbers of young refugees on the borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan and in Iran. In response to the increasing numbers of separated migrant children, whether trafficked or asylum seeking, European governments, including the UK, are involved in developing policy intended to discourage young asylum seekers from coming to Europe and to return unaccompanied minors seeking asylum to their country of origin into institutional settings. Recently, for example, the Council of Europe announced its intention to establish a camp in Kabul for the deportation of young Afghans who could be deported to the camp from the country in which they were seeking asylum and on reaching their 18th birthday be released as adults. All of these countries, of course, have signed up to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. That proposal has now morphed into the European Return Platform for Unaccompanied Minors, which is a joint initiative of Sweden, Netherlands, Norway and the UK. The intention is now to return minors to their country of origin. The European Return Platform says its aim is to trace the children's families but will also ensure somehow a safe and adequate shelter in the country of origin, and no minor will return home without a safe and orderly reception. It is instructive, I think, that the attempt to legitimate this strategy references the need to protect children from trafficking. For example, the BBC reported this news under the headline, "The government is concerned that more are being sent to the UK by their families, risking danger and hardship at the hands of traffickers." Similarly, some European countries have been trying to return minors under the first safe country rule. For many African migrants, this is Italy. Both of these initiatives strain the credibility of European governments' claim that they act with regard to the best interests of children as required by their ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Furthermore, different forms of child migration are in danger of being collapsed together under the rubric of trafficking, and this in fact closes down the scope for child and youth migration in the name of child protection. The definition of trafficking has been gradually widened from an initial focus on trafficking into sex work across national borders to trafficking for other forms of exploitation. For example, transporting drugs, producing drugs, sweated labour, domestic labour and benefit fraud, or even when parents have paid for a third party to organise accommodation and a school place for their child in another country. The fact that this third party has benefited economically from the child's migration is seen as a de facto case of trafficking. Most recently, the exploitation of the child in and of itself, regardless of whether or not movement across national borders has taken place, has been taken as a central characteristic of trafficking, so that now the policy discourse refers to internal or domestic trafficking. So there's a gradual expansion of this discourse, this field of concern. We can see here an echo of the concern about child labour, in which the ordinary, mundane, everyday and culturally acceptable labour of children across most of the world is elided in place of the sceptre of hyper-exploitation and sex work. Since the receiving countries of these new youth migrations are bound to govern in their own laws child migrants in ways that are congruent with the child's best interest rather than with immigration law, trafficking is a useful discourse for enabling governments to simultaneously claim that they are acting in the best interests of the child, while at the same time curbing routes for migration and pushing up the risks and therefore the costs of smuggling. Whilst the temptation to use this discourse, the anti-trafficking discourse, to protect young migrants from deportation is understandable, it is a risky strategy for refugee support organisations and other child advocacy groups to pursue, because it insists that the right to residence in the host country is linked to the child's status as a victim. Furthermore, since being the victim of trafficking implies the absence of consent or will to being moved in the first place, the possibility that the young migrant actively wants to be in the host country is ignored in favour of an interpretation that says protection is repatriation. The final mode of independent child migration I want to talk about is private fostering. This is the practice of placing a child in the care of distant relatives or strangers, not unlike the fosterage I discussed earlier. But here, these local practices are being stretched across international borders. In the UK, there has been a presumption that most international child fostering, that is, private fostering of a child overseas, involves West Africans. But recent research, including my own, shows that it is much broader than that and involves any nationals who already have transnational communities settled in the host country. What is most striking about this form of independent migration is that, at least in the UK, but I think also in the United States, it seems that it's mostly intended to improve children's educational outcomes by enabling them to access state education in an English-speaking country. So it's a form of migration that again relies on not only ideas about what children need, but the increasing formulation of the idea of the educated child as the good child, and education as being the route to a good childhood. Patterns of migration are changing as the possibilities for legal migration shrink and undocumented migrants are subjected to document checks when trying to access social services. Although many young refugees come to the UK, for example, because of historic connections between the UK and their country of origin. Some young refugees believe that the UK affords better opportunities for making the best of a difficult situation, for example, because English is an international language. As Charles Waters has argued, it is a consequence of the discursive construction of young refugees as exclusively vulnerable victims that neither the law nor refugee support agencies are able to recognise the refugees are simultaneously escaping violence and persecution and making decisions as educational and economic actors. People's migration trajectories are not arbitrary, even in situations where the agency may be constrained or thin. They move in order to accomplish specific material and symbolic goals. The circulation of children is no different in this respect than adult migration, although their decision-making and resources may be more constrained than that of adults in otherwise comparable social, cultural and political economic contexts. And they may, of course, be more vulnerable to exploitation and harm. Social networks are an important mechanism for facilitating migration journeys. Furthermore, it's likely that what Yuri has called network capital, of which social networks are a key dimension, is an important factor in shaping why, when and where people migrate to and at what points in their life course. It's likely that the qualities of a person's social networks make some migration trajectories more possible than others. Weak ties take young migrants geographically further than strong ties, but conversely, strong ties make it more possible for young migrants to make a socially meaningful life in the new country. Although policy discourse organises the circulation of children and young people into different objects of concern, trafficked, privately fostered, refugee, transnational adoptee, there is an underlying unity to child circulation in its mobilisation of social networks and its deployment as a strategy to augment the often precarious or fragile conditions of social reproduction. In one sense, there is nothing new about this, but globalisation has stretched local cultural practices and strategies across national and regional borders. What does this stretching of local cultural practices across national and regional borders mean for our responsibilities towards global children? Child protection in a global world can be conceptualised in two ways, structural and interpersonal. Most of what I have spoken about today attends to the structural issues of child protection and child welfare. But of course, these have other impacts on the interpersonal relationships of children to their families and friends. Child circulation is largely a consequence of the poor, adults and children, developing and using social networks to protect themselves from actual or potential shocks caused by the precarious conditions of social reproduction in a global context of uneven and unequal development. It is therefore a strategy that by and large seeks to protect children, but it often fails because movement brings both opportunities and risks. Existing social networks are stretched and often broken, and the fraying of the network leaves its members vulnerable. The conditions in which migration takes place are often illegal and involve criminal networks of smugglers, and this too renders children vulnerable, even while they and their parents are seeking to increase their security. So in answer to the question that inevitably and quite properly gets asked, what is to be done, I would suggest firstly that uneven development needs to be addressed. A global policy on child protection has to address the structural conditions, the precarious context of social reproduction, the poverty, in short, in which a majority of the world's children in both developed and developing countries are growing up. We need to better understand the social networks that the poor draw on in making life sustainable and work to strengthen those networks. Critically, we need to recognise the damage that current migration regimes and the obstacles they place to the free movement of peoples do to family networks, both in the ways that they separate children from their parents and the ways in which living below the radar renders children vulnerable. I want to finish by saying a little more about the second kind of circulation that this keynote is concerned with, the circulation of ideas about children. Ideas about who they are and what they need, about how they should be raised and by who, where they should spend their time and who with, and generally about their capacities, competencies, and vulnerabilities. All of these questions have multiple answers. What might be called practices of childhood, i.e. what children actually do and how adults and their peers interact with them, vary not only between but within cultures. The concept of the child is very plastic, even if rooted in the facts of biological immaturity. The idea that the state, that government, should involve itself in answering these questions is relatively recent and inseparable from the formation of global capitalism and the shifts that produced in what the government and economy needed from its populations. Even more recent is the idea that global forces, international law, international NGOs should be involved in addressing these questions. It's really not until the passing of the United Nations Convention in 1989, and indeed this global summit is part of that move. This shift from family and culture to state and international politics as the arbiters of good childhoods has put into global circulation new ideas about what children need. Most recently, for example, in the push to expand early years education in the global south. I want to end with a plea to tread cautiously. In the name of the best interests of the child, all kinds of things have been done in the last 2 centuries that subsequent generations have judged as violent, reprehensible, and damaging. I am thinking, of course, about such policies as the forced removal of mixed parentage children from their Aboriginal mothers, or the forced migration of orphans from England to the white settler colonies by Barnardos and others in the 19th century, or indeed, as we heard earlier, the forced removal of First Nation children from their families into reservation schools. All of this was done in the best interest of the child. Even today, we find that plans to deport young refugees are framed within this rubric of the child's best interests. I think we need to acknowledge that the reason our ideas about what is in children's best interests get accepted is not because of their inherent correctness. They gain such purchase at a global level and are then inscribed through various mechanisms at a local level, not because of their intrinsic and irrefutable correctness, but because of the place of our governments within the international system. Calling for action in the name of the best interests of the child is an endeavour fraught with hubris. To avoid that, we need to develop our thinking about child welfare and child protection in real dialogue with local communities and not over their heads. One way of doing that is perhaps to think in terms of the circulation of ideas and practice, rather than the movement of a set of ideas and practices from one location, the global, to another, the local. Thank you.